First Minister, thank you very much for giving us your time this morning. When Theresa May returns with her Brexit terms, is it inevitable that the SNP will be using that to push for another independence referendum?
I think there will be another independence referendum. Depending on what Theresa May returns with will influence my judgment on the timing of that. And I'm not going to speculate at this stage. We can talk about the likely outcomes of that, but I will wait until I know for sure before setting out my views on the timing.
Sure. We know certain terms that are on the table on what Theresa May is looking at herself. What Brexit terms do you think that you and your party could vote for that you would say, yeah, this is a better deal than going for another independence referendum just now?
Well, in terms of put the question of an independent, I think there will be another independence referendum for Scotland at some stage.
Regardless of the Brexit outcomes?
Sure, but the timing of that will to some extent depend on the Brexit outcome. But if you're asking me the question, are there any circumstances in which we would vote for the Brexit deal that Theresa May brings back? Our bottom line has always been from the outset of this single market and customs union membership. So I cannot envisage SNP MPs voting for anything that doesn't include that. After all, Scotland voted by 62% to remain in the EU, and anything that takes Scotland out of the single market and customs union, I can't envisage SNP MPs voting for.
Can I just be clear on that though? Would you vote for a Brexit deal that had the idea of Britain staying in the customs union or the single market?
You said, I want us to stay in the single market and in the customs union. Now,
would you vote for that proposal?
It doesn't look as if that will be what Theresa May brings back at this stage. I think if these negotiations reach a point of crisis, I think it's still possible to get that back on the table. But we will look at what comes back, but I cannot envisage us voting for anything that doesn't include single market and customs union.
But this is a crucial question, First Minister, because there's abstaining from a vote and there's voting for it. Would you vote for a Brexit deal that had us staying in the customs union and the single market?
That's what we've been arguing for, a position to stay in the single market and customs union. So we would support staying in the single market and customs union. I think at this stage it's not looking to me as if that's what she will bring back from the EU negotiations. Now, that said, if she brings back something that is a bad deal, a no deal or a blind deal Brexit, and the House of Commons doesn't support that, I think everything then is to play for in terms of putting the single market and customs union back on the table.
If you vote for a Brexit deal that includes Britain staying in the customs union and single market, as unlikely as that might seem at this point in time, would it then be inconceivable that you would similarly go for an independence referendum?
With the greatest respect, with the greatest respect, you're almost tying yourself in knots with your hypotheticals here. Let's just wait and see what comes out of the next few weeks, and then I will set out my views on the timing of an independence referendum. I'm not going to get into multiple hypotheticals because
we are about 5 months away from Brexit Day now, though, and we had SNP members saying time is running out.
We're possibly only a few weeks away from this phase of the negotiations ending. Originally, people thought that would be this month at the October EU Council. It now looks as if that may slip into an EU Council in November. So we're only a few weeks away from getting to the end of this phase of negotiations, which is the point at which I will set out what my views are on timing.
But you've fought for independence since you were 16. You must have thought a lot about this. Is there any Brexit deal that the Prime Minister could present you with that you would say would be a better idea than having another independence referendum?
I think independence is the best future for Scotland. The decision I have to
make
is around
the
timing of an independence referendum. I think independence, as you said, I've believed it since I was 16 years old. I've campaigned for it since I was 16 years old. And the reason I think that's the best future for Scotland is because it means that Scotland can't have change imposed on us against our will, as is happening with Brexit. Scotland voted 62% to stay in the EU, and yet we face exit against our will. Independence means that we would be able to steward our own resources as a country, build a better future for the next generation.
I know why you believe in independence, First Minister, but
I thought I'd share it with you.
Sure, but I suppose the question is it futile was waiting? Are we just waiting to see how bad Brexit can get so that it can boost support for Scottish independence?
It's not futile. It's showing respect to the importance of the decision. Let me explain in hopefully quite simple terms why I think it's right to wait. The future relationship between the EU and the UK will be the context in which Scotland would become independent. So the detail of that future relationship will inevitably, whether I like it or not, shape some of the answers to questions people in Scotland would have about the implications of independence. It's about allowing clarity to emerge so that people in Scotland, if they are making this judgment again, can do so in a fully informed way, and I think that's sensible.
There are critics of yours, believe it or not, out there, who would say that those critics would say that why should Theresa May listen to you? Because you want out of the UK anyway, and regardless of what deal she comes back with, and if she makes concessions, then you're still going to want to leave the UK.
Firstly, critics are perfectly entitled to say what they want. That's democracy. I've got a job to do as First Minister to make decisions in the best interests, as I see them, of the country. But secondly, in terms of Theresa May not listening to me, for a lot of people in Scotland, the last 2 years have demonstrated very powerfully the case for independence. Not only was Scotland's voice ignored in that referendum, since then we've made constructive proposals for compromise, staying in the single market and customs union. They've been completely dismissed. The request of devolved administrations to have a greater say in the negotiation has been cast aside. There's been a raid on the Scottish Parliament's powers, and when the Scottish Parliament said no to that, the UK government's response was to take us to court. Scotland's voice has been ignored at every step of the way, and that democratic deficit is one of the most compelling arguments, surely, for Scotland becoming independent.
There is serious talk about Northern Ireland being offered special status. What would you do if Northern Ireland was offered special status but Scotland was not?
Well, I think if that's a position that we end up in, and we will see over the next few weeks exactly where this ends up, I'd make 2 points to that. Firstly, I hope the majority of people, certainly those who care about the situation in Northern Ireland, we all want to see a solution that doesn't recreate a border between the north and south, and that doesn't in any way jeopardise the Good Friday Agreement and the Northern Ireland peace process, and that should be the priority of everybody. But secondly, if there is a special deal for Northern Ireland that keeps Northern Ireland effectively in the single market, the damage that potentially does to Scotland is even greater than just Brexit itself, because you would suddenly put Scotland at a disadvantage if businesses could see that Northern Ireland would keep them within the single market. So in those circumstances, the case for Scotland not being taken out of the single market becomes even stronger.
Do you have a strategy to ensure that Scotland would be kept in the single market?
We've got a number of things that we will look at and continue to look at. I'm not going to share all of my thinking with you right now, much as you might like me to. But all along, we've had a hierarchy all along of preferences. We've tried to compromise. My top preference is to stay in the EU. After that, my preference is for the whole UK to stay in the single market. And if that can't happen, then yes, I want to look at options for Scotland to stay in the single market, and that becomes an even greater imperative if Northern Ireland gets that solution. But we will take these things step by step, and my guiding principle in all of this is to act in a way that best protects interests in Scotland.
Do you feel a bit powerless?
Scotland is at the moment in a position where we do not have the influence we should have as a country, because our voice is lost in the bigger UK, and I think that has profound implications. That democratic deficit has real implications for our economy and our society, and we're seeing that very sharply in Brexit. And I do think the last 2 years, you said earlier on, I've been a lifelong supporter of independence, but in the last 2 years, the argument, certainly the democratic argument for independence, has become much more sharply focused than it's ever been before.
I have to ask you, you've mentioned that you would back a second referendum on Brexit. Does this set a precedent? Because although you've mentioned you had your white paper, that was of course proposals. You never got it tested with the UK negotiators, and Theresa May might tell you that you don't always get what you want. So is there now a precedent set, principle in Scotland that you back the idea of a people's vote?
In my view, no. And because I do think that the white paper was not just a set of proposals. The white paper was upfront in advance of the referendum about the trade-offs and compromises, and people knew what they were voting for in terms of the relationship. Take a currency union, for example, not something that was always supported even by people on the yes side of the referendum, but we were upfront about that. We were upfront about some of the regulatory harmony that would still be required to ensure free trade across all parts of the UK. So those trade-offs we were honest about upfront, and people knew what they were voting for. The contrast between that and the Brexit vote, where we had the lie on the side of the bus and that was it, and not just no detail at the point of the vote, no detail now, and in all likelihood, in my view, no detail at the point of exit next March. So I think we're in exceptional circumstances right now, which is why if there is a proposal, and I don't know whether there will be, for a second EU referendum, then SNP MPs would vote for that.